I would like to highlight one word which Malvika used in this introduction. This is an introductory session for understanding the concept of administrative law. And because it is an introductory session, it will restrict itself to what administrative law means, why was it required, what is its scope, or what are its functions. In most textbooks on administrative law, this will usually be the first chapter. And one of the things which you will notice in those chapters is very, very, very few references to case law. The reason is that in concrete cases and controversies, by which I mean those which reach a court, parties and the court take the existence of administrative law as a given. They take the meaning of administrative law as a given. Those cases concern a distinct though related aspect of administrative law, that is the judicial control over administrative law or judicial control over the actors in administrative law. That is a topic for later, and depending upon how you find this session, hopefully I can come back and explore that area with you also. Another area which I will not be dealing with in this session is the difference between the nature of administrative acts or administrative functions and, for example, judicial functions or quasi-judicial functions or legislative functions, etc. That usually is also dealt with after you first understand the concept of administrative law in itself. So again, today we will be only discussing how administrative law originated, where the need originated, broadly what is its meaning, and lastly, what is its scope or its functions. Now, administrative law, as the name itself suggests, is concerned with the administration of a state or a polity. That is its first point of distinction from what we otherwise call constitutional law. Constitutional law relates to the constitution of the state, the creation of the state. Administrative law relates to how that state functions or is administered. So going from there, the origins of the state, if you will go to any textbook on administrative law or even constitutional law, the origins of any state were very limited. The idea of the state was extremely limited. Broadly, the state was to have four functions. One was to provide for the common defense, that is, the community for whom the state acted had to be protected from outside threat. Second was the maintenance of law and order, that is, within the community, the citizens or participants or members follow the rules of that community. Third was the dispensation of justice, that is, when a rule is broken, the aggrieved party must have justice done to it, and the state had the obligation to provide that justice. And fourth, which came a little later after these three issues, was the collection of taxes. Because A, B, and C, common defense, law and order, and justice delivery, all require financial means. And therefore, a fourth obligation of a fourth duty of the state, or a fourth function of the state, came to collection of taxes. As I think it's fairly simple to fairly easy to note that this was a rather simple society. There was very little which made the state ambiguous, the role of the state ambiguous. Everybody knew, for example, and let me just give an example. Everybody knew who the king was. Everybody knew what the king's duties were towards the citizens. Everybody knew what the citizens' duties were towards the king, and everything else was hunky-dory. With the march of time, and especially in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, the role of the state slowly began to expand, because it was found that limiting the state to just these four functions means that in everything else, individuals would have complete freedom to do whatever they wanted, so long as they did not mess with the state. For example, if you were a landowner, you could have serfs or slaves who were effectively property, and you could treat them just as you treat any other piece of property. So long as your relation with that slave or that serf did not come in the way of the king doing his duties or exercising his rights over citizens, the state had no problem. But with the Industrial Revolution, with the increase in automated production, what happened is the sheer number of workers, or those who toiled for others, increased. And with that increase, expectations of the state increased. When you had pre-industrial revolution, for example, let's take the example of Gutenberg and his printing press. Before the printing press, those who had to prepare books, those who had to publish them, it was a very solitary act. One had to depend upon oneself to do it. With the introduction of the press, you could now hire other people to look after the press, whereas you, the owner of the press, looked at only what the press is to publish. But which means that where earlier there was only one person involved in activity, now that one person had hired, say, 4 or 5 others. This happened across societies. It happened across industries. Textiles. Earlier, you had fewer number of people who would grow their own crops, make their own food, or make their own clothes. But with the spinning jenny, with other inventions, one was able to produce an excess and then sell that excess, which means that capitalism's role increased, and with it increased the number of people who were involved in any activity of the state. Given that increase in numbers, naturally, the expectations of those people increased. Serfs, or those who earlier worked as serfs or indentured labor, suddenly realized that somebody needs to step in between them and their masters, or them and their employers, who could shield them from that employer. This introduction of the state between the employer or the master on one hand and the employee, servant, agent on the other is really the introduction of what we today call the administrative state or the welfare state. on an extreme, this was signified by communism, which said that everybody should have equal rights, equal status, that the means of production in a society should be distributed equally between all citizens. There shouldn't be distinctions between employers, employees, etc. And as you moved on the spectrum from communism over to the extreme right, which is fascism, you had a whole series of forms of government which looked at different levels of government involvement in the lives of ordinary people. So on the communism side, government was in effect everything, because it was only the government who could ensure that everybody had equality. That it practically did not work out that way is a different story. We are now talking only about the theory of it. On the fascist side, you had a belief that there was one clear ruler or authority, and everybody else's job was to follow the diktats of that authority. Between these two extremes, you had various alternatives. You had social democracy, which is not entirely communism. It has socialist underpinnings, but also democratic underpinnings, which India is like. You have capitalist democracies, which are more like America. And you have something more in the middle, which is England. Now, this expansion of the role of the state meant that, unlike the old days when the state's role was common defense, law and order, justice, and collecting taxes, over time the state's role changed. And we are now today in a position where the state is protector. It protects not just from external aggression or internal disturbances. It protects you from poverty. It protects you from pandemics. It protects you from inequality, etc. We then have state as provider. It provides employment. It provides social security, pensions. It provides an income for people who cannot afford to work or cannot work. It also provides intangible things. It is a provider of the justice delivery system. It is a provider of other services, goods or services. The third is the state as entrepreneur. In the old days, for example, when the East India Company was set up, the East India Company, apart from having a charter from the king or queen, was otherwise an entirely private body. It was only in 1857, after the First War of Independence, that Britain as a political entity took over sovereignty of India. Till then, a large part of India was being governed by a company. Although that went away with the British imposing political rule over India, between then and today, the state has taken upon itself the role of entrepreneur. And that role has only expanded after independence, because after independence, we took a conscious decision to make a planned economy. So certain industries were exclusively meant for the state to own and to provide. If you see Article 19 of the Constitution, 19(1)(g) allows the freedom for to engage in trade or professions. But the corresponding restriction in 19(6) says that the right in clause G will not stop the state from creating a monopoly in its own favor, for example, the railways, atomic power. So you have the state as entrepreneur. But of course, the state is not just entrepreneur because it does things on its own. It is also entrepreneur because in many cases, it provides loans. It provides capital to others to grow. The State Bank of India, when it gives a loan, or central bank, is the state acting as entrepreneur. The fourth role is state as regulator. Here is where administrative law really comes in. It is the state who regulates society, regulates the relationship between a railway and its passengers, a company and its shareholders, a shopkeeper and his customers, because it makes laws that govern that relationship. And it is in regulating that relationship that you apply administrative law. And lastly, you have the state as arbiter. That is, the state becomes a decision maker. The state becomes for example, let me just give you an example. Telecoms. There is a body called the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India. It's a administrative body. It is not part of the government. It's not a ministry by itself. It is a body which regulates, and in regulation, it also determines disputes between various stakeholders in the community which it regulates. Thus, telecom consumers can go to TRAI, telecom providers can go to TRAI, and TRAI will act as arbiter or judge in the first instance in resolving disputes or in balancing interests. Arbiter is a very broad word. It doesn't just mean deciding disputes, it also means simply making judgments. What is good, what is bad, what is balanced, what is unbalanced, what is an extreme, what is the middle path. So the state has that role. So from simply doing defense, law and order, justice, and taxes, you have gone to a state which is now protector, provider, entrepreneur, regulator, arbiter. And this expansion in the state's role means that you now require rules to regulate the relationship between the individual and the state. Simply because the state now has so many powers, functions, duties, responsibilities, that it is important to realize how that state will function, how it will interact with its citizens. At a macro level, that is the function of constitutional law. For example, at the macro level, you will divide, we have divided in our constitution, the law making or the power to, or we've really divided the state itself into three branches: the executive, which executes the law, the legislature, which makes the law, and the judiciary, which enforces the law. But at a micro level, once you have these bodies in place, at a micro level, when you have to look how these bodies are to act, most of it is a function of administrative law, because then you are describing or trying to understand the manner in which a body will act. The constitution only defines the role of the body. Administrative law tells the body how that role is to be discharged. With this, with this sort of basic understanding of why administrative law was required, let's now go to a little more formal discussion of definitions of administrative law. I will be looking at definitions from not conflicting, but two perspectives. There is the English perspective, which we traditionally have followed, and there is the American perspective, which, according to me, we are moving towards. So, within the English view of administrative law, Professor Dicey, I'm sure you all must have heard of Dicey. He was the professor of the Vinerian professor of English law at Oxford University. He said that administrative law is that part of the legal system which defines the legal status and liabilities of all state officials, defines the rights and liabilities of private individuals in their dealings with public officials, and specifies the procedure by which those rights and liabilities are enforced. So a three-part definition. First, the legal status and liabilities of all state officials. Therefore, what is the status of the executive, that is the president, cabinet? What is the status of people below that level, the civil service, or heads of departments, or an officer in a PSU? What is their exact legal status? Because on that legal status will depend what are their duties, what are their rights, their powers, what are their liabilities. So legal status and liabilities of all state officials. The second part is the rights and liabilities of private individuals in their dealings with public officials. Therefore, that portion of administrative law which discusses the interface between state and citizen. What are the rights of citizens? What are the liabilities of citizens? Rights, meaning, for example, if I am asking for a telephone connection or a gas connection, then I have to get it in order in which I have made the application. You can't have somebody being favored over me. Liabilities, it is my liability to stand in line and not try to get favored treatment. Or if I have to get a pension, pension is my right. The liability is I have to put in certain amount of work. I have to also follow the manner in which I am entitled to get my pension. These are just very broad examples, but it tells you the second function of administrative law is to define rights and liabilities of private individuals when they deal with public officials. And third, specification of the procedure by which those rights and liabilities are enforced. So when we say that when you have an administrative adjudication or when you have administrative action, you have to follow certain rules of law. When we say that when let's say a government department and somebody makes an application, let me take the telecom licenses scandal. Now, one procedure was first come, first served. Another procedure was auction. Administrative law is concerned many a times with how those procedures are implemented. Constitutional law only informs what is right or wrong within the constitutional structure. But when one actually puts first come, first serve or auction into action, you are at that point doing an exercise only of administration. Another definition, a slightly broader definition, is given by Sir Ivor Jennings. Sir Ivor Jennings is important because if you read up the history of our Constituent Assembly, before Gandhiji insisted that he wanted Dr. Ambedkar to be the chairperson of the drafting committee of the Constituent Assembly, Nehru actually proposed Sir Ivor Jennings to be chairperson. So he is important from the Indian point of view because he was regarded quite highly. He said that administrative law is the law relating to the administration. It's a little tautological, but unfortunately, administration is so closely aligned to administrative that it's difficult for anybody not to say this. It really it confuses more, but therefore he then qualifies it. He says it's not just the law which relates to the administration. He also says it determines the organization, powers, and duties of administrative authorities. So the law relating to the administration and the law which determines the organization, the powers, and the duties of the people of the administration. To go across the Atlantic now and in America, the view is not very, very different, but the view is colored by a strict constitutionalism. In England, they don't have a written constitution. Therefore, when they describe legal rules and legal principles or legal concepts, it is not easy to apply them to real world situations very easily because there is not, or at least traditionally, there was not a very strict division between legislature, executive, judiciary. You had the queen or the king who was at the top. It was her government who was the executive. It was the lords appointed by her who were part of parliament. It was the commons who were her subjects who formed the House of Commons. And even the judiciary was the judicial committee of the Privy Council. The Privy Council is an advisory body of the monarch. So you really had a fuse of all wings of the state. Whereas America has always prided itself in having a written constitution, and in that constitution clearly demarcating the branches of the government. And therefore, you will see that the American view of administrative law is geared towards the executive department of government, not broadly executive, legislative, and judicial. As you will see, the Americans look at administration as an adjunct or extension of the executive branch of the government alone. So, for instance, Reginald Parker was a professor of law at the Arkansas School of Law, the University of Arkansas School of Law. He said that according to him, administrative law was the law that governs and is applied by the executive branch of government. So if any of you have seen the American Constitution, Article 1 says there shall be a Congress and the legislative powers of the union shall be vested in the Congress. Article 2 says there shall be a president and the entire executive power will be vested in that president. And Article 3 says that there shall be one Supreme Court and such inferior courts as Congress may by law establish. So in the first three parts of the Constitution itself, they have said our government will be divided. Our government will be classified into these three separate branches. And within that division, administrative law or administration is largely a function of the executive branch, because the executive branch is the one which has the obligation to see that the law is faithfully executed. That's the primary duty of the president and therefore of the executive branch of government, is to see that the law is faithfully executed. And therefore, when you say the law is faithfully executed, it means that when the law acts upon the people, when it actually affects people's actions, that is a matter which is looked at by the executive branch. And therefore, Parker says that administrative law is the law that governs and is applied by the executive branch of government. Similarly, Professor Davis, who was professor at the University of Minnesota Law School, he said administrative law concerns the powers and procedures of administrative agencies, including the judicial review of administrative action. This definition is somewhat similar to Sir Ivor Jennings's definition, but as I will, shortly show you, it is also colored by the American view that administration is different from lawmaking, legislature, and law enforcing or interpreting, that is judiciary. With these four broad definitions, let's now see what the scope or functions of administrative law are. To my mind, the first important function is to determine the structure and powers of the organs of administration. A state has to be administered by actors. The first task of administrative law, therefore, and its, so to speak, its first link with constitutional law is to determine the structure, the powers, and the functions of those actors. Let's take SEBI as an example. It is a part of the administrative law which says how will SEBI be structured, what will SEBI's powers be, what will be the functions which SEBI executes or puts into work. The second important function, according to me, is placing of limits on the powers of administrators. Here we go slightly further away from pure constitutional law. The only aspect of constitutional law is that constitutional law sets some limits. Article 14 sets a limit, Article 19 sets a limit, Article 21 sets a limit, but the actual procedures themselves set a limit. For example, when an administrative body acts, an administrative body like, say, let's just take SEBI itself, or why constrain ourselves to one thing? Let's just say when the Registrar of Companies acts. I'm giving all examples because those are my day-to-day reference points. When the Registrar of Companies or the Ministry of Corporate Affairs regulates companies, there are rules. Rules say when you are, For example, if you're going to strike off a company, you have to give notice. When you are going to seek information from a company, you can seek XYZ, not ABC. When you deal with citizens, when you consider their files, when you make decisions which affect their lives, the citizens may find out about it. So you don't have the power to act in secret. RTI Act limits on their power. So that is also a part of administrative law, how the administration is controlled and kept within its boundaries. The third, methods and procedures for the exercise of power and performance of functions. Simply put, we hear a lot about tenders. The government gives out tenders. The union government, the finance ministry, has a almost 300 or 400 page document which sets out the rules for procurement of goods. Its job of that manual is to set out the method and procedure by which government departments will exercise their power to acquire services for the state, goods for the use of the state, etc. That's a manner, that's administrative law. It also says how will you do it? Auction. Auction means you have to perform certain functions. Therefore, methods and procedures for exercise of power and the performance of functions. Because if I have the function to provide medicine at inexpensive rates to citizens as the state, how do I go about in the performance of that function? I have to ensure that I acquire medicines at an inexpensive rate or a feasible rate. I have to see that priorities are set. I have to see, like happened with vaccination right now, who needs it most and who needs it first, on downwards. That's the administration in action. And that is administrative law in action. That's not constitutional law. Constitutional law only says all of these things have to be done by something called an executive, for example, or all of these things have to be done ensuring fairness, etc. The actual doing of it is administrative law. The fourth, and for us as lawyers, the most important or interesting, it includes, or the scope includes, the methods by which administration is controlled. This is what I referred to earlier as the judicial review of administrative action, which means that when you give the administration powers to give out licenses, powers to give out medicine, powers to give out tenders, powers to regulate the rates of electricity supply or telephone rates, mobile phone rates, somebody has to exercise a review power over the performance of those functions so that it's not left to the sweet will of whoever the officer is. So within the scope or functions of administrative law is also the devising of methods by which powers given to the administration can be controlled, by which legal remedies can be afforded when individual rights are infringed. And lastly, the determination of administrative procedures. This is, I've dealt with it a little differently and little separately because I wanted to end end my talking with a quick reference to what in America a statute called the Administrative Procedures Act. We don't really have precisely this kind of an act, which broadly deals with administrative procedures. I believe that one of the foremost functions of administrative law is to make the functions of administrative authorities, functions including how they exercise their powers or how they discharge their duties, open and answerable to the people. And so, as a function of administrative law, it may be a good idea to have a broad-based statute which lays down how the administration can be made more accountable to the people. Now, the Administrative Procedures Act is quite interesting, and I think you should read up more about it. It came about as a reaction. Most of you would have heard about the Great Depression. To overcome the depression, President Roosevelt, in his famous first 100 days, set up or increased the role of the state. Because till then, it was felt that the depression was caused because there was very little oversight on the actions of individual business owners, the actions of individual bankers, the actions of individual companies who owned the means of production. They were just left to their only objective would be how do I maximize returns and not how I ensure that my laborers or my workers are fairly paid, how the system of government, the system or the economy can maintain balance, how banking has to be safeguarded from giving out loans to the friends of the bank managers, for example, just to give a very crass example. So he, in order to remedy the situation, he introduced a lot of legislation which said there will be a national labor relations board, which will determine the relationship between employer and employee. There'll be something called an agricultural adjustments agency, which will ensure that agriculture and how people work in agriculture is regulated so that there is employment generation, income security, market security, etc. He basically increased the role of the administrative state. And this happened, say, in the mid to late 30s and went on till the 40s. And in 1946, Congress, the legislative branch, realized that it's all well and good that you have now built up these bodies and given the state this role of protecting its citizens. But even those actors need to be restrained and need to be controlled and need to be made answerable to the citizens. And therefore came the Administrative Procedures Act. The purposes of that act are fourfold. First, administrative agencies must keep the public informed about their organization, their procedures, and their rules. An administrative body can't hide from the people. It has to be open and tell the people, keep them informed about how it is functioning. Second, it has to allow an element of public participation when it is making rules. This is something which we already follow. For example, under the Maharashtra Regional and Town Planning Act, every time you have a new development plan, it first has to be published for objections and suggestions. The regional plan ultimately is a rule, it's a law. But because it's a rule or law which is going to act on the rights of people, the people must have a say on the content of that rule or law. Therefore, the second function of the Administrative Procedures Act, and something which we also follow here, is to provide for public participation in the rule-making process. The third was to establish uniform standards for the actions or the conduct of the authority. It can't be that the Defense Department acts one way, the State Department acts, Social Welfare Department acts a third way. Can't act like that. There has to be regularity and some amount of uniformity so that citizens have some amount of certainty, some certain amount, sense of balance and regularity. And the fourth, and which is important, is the scope of judicial review of the first three. This, of course, is also something which we face day in, day out in our system. because it is felt that now that you have created a welfare state, now that you have given this state the role of entrepreneur and all of that, then you have to give the state a little bit of play within the joints. And therefore, a judge or the judiciary or anybody outside can't willy-nilly interfere and say, no, 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 I don't agree with this policy. I think this policy is better. And therefore, one part of the Administrative Procedures Act there and a part of a lot of laws here is to define the scope of judicial review or judicial intervention within administrative action. I discuss this last thing only because I feel it might make some sense and it might clarify for not just the public, but for lawyers ourselves, law students, people who want to understand the law, to have one single body of rules, which at least sets out broad parameters of administrative law, and something which I feel is a good idea to replicate here. I believe I have now covered the three things which I wanted to discuss. Let me just give you a quick recap. The need for administrative law came from the change in the role of the state, from being only a laissez-faire sort of situation to a state which is now everything: protector, provider, entrepreneur, regulator, arbiter. Therefore, you need to control its increasing powers. Definitions: it is the law which governs how a state is administered. And the scope: it defines or it includes within itself the actual structure, powers, and functions of administrative bodies. It sets down limits on their powers. It sets out or it includes within its scope the methods and procedures by which the administration is supposed to act. And it gives the methods by which the powers of the administration are controlled, which is also the judicial review of administrative action. With this, I'll welcome any questions you may have.
So, Rohan, meanwhile, what are the challenges in the implementation of administrative law in India, according to you?
Administrative law is such a broad term. There really can't be anything which can be easily called a problem in the implementation of administrative law. It's not, administrative law is not like the law of arbitration. You know, it's not like, so I can talk about what are the problems in the implementation of, say, arbitration law, but administrative law is so broad and it is so all encompassing that it's very difficult to pinpoint, other than making uh, political statements about how administrative law is misused, etc., etc. So i would I would say, more than problems with the implementation of administrative law, there are a lot of problems in the application of administrative law, because there's a tendency to sort of mix various areas of law and administrative law. And I think the first duty of anybody who speaks on administrative law is to try and make a division in the minds of students of the law between administrative law itself and what administrative law does. So while I can't say there are particular problems in the implementation of administrative law, there are a lot of problems in the application of administrative law. For example, you continue to have debates about, can courts get into policy? Is policy not the realm of administration? Just a quick example: tenders, because those are the matters which most often come. You have the decision in Tata Press, right, which says, now that you have made this administrative state and now that you have let the administrative state enter into commercial contracts, the commercial realm. Now the courts have to take a back seat. Now that principle is fine when you read it for the first time. But when you apply that principle, it is very difficult to know where to stop. So rather than there being a problem in the implementation of administrative law, there might very well be an over implementation of administrative law.
And the next question from a participant is, what is the difference between rules and regulations?
If you see a modern statute, okay, you will find ordinarily around the end of the statute, you will find two sections. A section which is a rule making power and a section which is a regulation making power. See, we have to understand one thing: rules, regulations, bylaws, etc., 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 are interchangeable words. They are names given to something. They are interchangeable. But broadly, the way in which the Indian legislature and therefore Indian law understands it is rules are normally those which Parliament allows the executive to make. Because when you have an act, for example, Companies Act, okay, the Companies Act will say the central government may make rules consistent with this law, with this act. The regulation provision will say, for example, the registrar may make regulations. Or if it's the SEBI Act, it will say the central government may make rules, SEBI may make regulations. So sometimes the difference is who is the maker of the rule or the regulation. In many cases, rule is usually by the direct executive authority, whereas regulation is by the subordinate authority or the administrative body. But it's not a uniform sort of distinction. It's a fluid answer.
The next question is, can you share some books on administrative law, the names?
My Bible is MP Jain, Principles of Administrative Law. For Indian administrative law, I think this is the standard book. Okay, it may not be very helpful to prepare for exams because you saw its length and the fact that this is just volume 1, but it's a very accessible book. It covers all topics quite comprehensively. And as far as if you want to look at English, an English view of administrative law, Wade, Professor Wade's book on administrative law. That's, I mean, those are the two books which come to mind.
The next question is, how can the understanding of administrative law help in general litigation practice?
Like I said, if you see, for example, if I open this book and show you the first chapter, there is very little case law which talks about what is administrative law. Okay, understanding administrative law helps mostly for practicing lawyers. At least it helps when a question comes of judicial control over administrative action. Let me give you an example. Last year I appeared for the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India in a matter where it had issued something called a tariff order. And that tariff order provided, all of you have cable TV, right? And subscribing to cable TV, I believe most of you subscribe to bouquets of channels, right? What the TRAI found was, because cable operators or broadcasters were allowed to make bouquets of channels, what they were doing is they would include, for example, Star would include Star Plus, and then within the bouquet include 50 other channels which most people don't need to watch or they don't want to watch. Maybe it's because it is Star Uriya or Star Bangla, which which doesn't have demand all across the country. So what would happen is, because broadcasters' profits are based mainly on advertising, the more eyeballs they get, the higher their revenue. Therefore, they have an incentive to increase the reach of their channels to more people, irrespective of whether those people require those channels or want those channels or not. Now, when the TRAI tried to put a restriction on broadcasters' ability to make these bouquets, the argument which was raised against us, because that law was challenged, the argument which was made was, this is not a legislative function or a delegated legislative function. This is actually an administrative adjudication. By restricting the broadcaster's ability to make a bouquet, I have tried to pass a judgment or a quasi-judicial, take a quasi-judicial decision about what they can and cannot do. As we will go forward, if I get the chance to come back to you, the next chapter or the next session would have been distinguishing between delegated legislation and administrative order making or quasi-judicial decision making. Because if it is delegated legislation, then there is a presumption of validity. The broadcasters had challenged, remember, the constitutional validity of the tariff order. We were saying that this is done in the exercise of a rule making power, which is a quasi legislative function, and therefore you have to extend the same presumption of constitutional validity which is available for any legislation to this action, because the settled law is, like a statute or primary legislation is entitled to a presumption of constitutionality, delegated legislation also is entitled to that presumption. The same is not true with a quasi-judicial order or an administrative order or the outcome of a plainly administrative function. That does not enjoy the presumption of constitutionality. So knowing administrative law, knowing the niceties of administrative law are important in such cases where the regulator is trying to say, my action is of a certain quality, it is quasi-legislative, and the citizen or the individual or the company is trying to say, or the private company is trying to say, no, this is the exercise of a quasi-judicial function or an administrative function and not a legislative rule-making power, and therefore you don't have the presumption of constitutionality. So these are the sorts of areas in which administrative law really helps. I hope that was at least a kind of an answer to your question.
Yes. The next question is, can you summarize the relation between administrative law and the constitution?
Let me put it this way. Constitutional law is related to the constitution of a state, how that state is built up. In our case, Article 52 example, which says there shall be a president of India, right? It constitutes the executive body. There shall be a president of India, and Article, I think 53 says that all executive power shall be vested in the president. That is the function of constitutional law. Administrative law is, once you have the executive in place, how will the executive go about doing its work? That the constitution does not say in explicit terms. Let me go to a slightly different example. The next part, say Article 89, 88, 89 onwards, starts dealing with legislature. It says there shall be a house of the people and there shall be a house council of states. They shall pass laws in this way. But then it doesn't speak of, when it speaks of laws, it only speaks of exercising legislative power in the sense of Article 245 and 246, the lists. Parliament makes laws on the subjects in those lists according to how 245 and 246 divide that power. Within those laws, when you have to actually implement those laws, the constitution doesn't really say anything about how do you implement those laws. The only thing which the constitution does say is you will not implement the law arbitrarily. You will not implement any law in a way that will take away the freedom of speech, expression, worship, etc. You will not implement the law to deprive a person of personal liberty. But other than that, constitutional law does not really define the actual day-to-day operation of the government. Administrative law is what defines that. So constitutional law concerns with the constitution, that is the creation of the state. Administrative law deals with the administration or the acting or the functioning of the state. All thanks should flow from here. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. And if there are any more questions, please feel free. You have my email. Please let me have any
Sure, sure.
questions that you have.